Is bigger better when it comes to spaceships? Let's dive into it. I've always been kind of amused how some people are absolutely fascinated with huge, gigantic spaceships. YouTube is inundated with videos of ship-size comparisons. It seems like people's imaginations are stimulated by imagining giant spaceships or starships. So let's answer the question. Are bigger spaceships really better? What advantages and disadvantages do giant spaceships have? We can make some real-world comparisons based on the functions of seagoing vessels and actual space-going vessels. But we're going to use a lot of ships from sci-fi as case examples, where I've put them into different categories. These size categories are A. Small adventure ships like a runabout from Star Trek or a Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. B. Corvette-sized ships that are big compared to adventure ships like the Corellian Corvette from Star Wars, perhaps a Klingon bird of prey, something between 100 and 200 meters in length. C. Cruiser-sized ships in the range of 200 to 400 meters like a Constitution-class cruiser from Star Trek or a Nebulon B frigate from Star Wars. D. A giant battleship or carrier-sized ship like an Imperial Star Destroyer from Star Wars. So now we're talking over, upwards of 600 to 2,000 meters or so. E. Superships like the Super Star Destroyer Executor from Star Wars or the Eclipse Star Destroyer, something around 10 to 20 kilometers in length. And finally, G. Megaships like the Triglavian Hordage class worldship from EVE Online, or Snoke's Supremacy from the non-canon Star Wars sequel trilogy. These are 50 kilometers and 60 kilometers respectively in width. Not all of these ships have to be warships. The thing we want to establish here is that a ship that is huge, it should have a really good reason to be huge, and not huge just for hugeness sake. Hopefully I can emphasize that small ships have a place in our sci-fi or even real lives as much as larger ships. Alright, let's start with A. Adventure ships. Something about the size of a runabout. Something that's a bit larger than a fighter or a shuttle, but could almost be classified as a gunboat or heavy bomber. Now Starfleet's runabout is more of a Swiss Army knife vessel than a combat ship, but from here we can split off into two basic roles. The space transport, like the Millennium Falcon, which is basically a space RV for passengers and minor cargo items. We've seen this iteration of ships in many sci-fi scenarios, like the Jupiter from Lost in Space, or Lone Star ship in Spaceballs. You see, this type of vessel is great for adventures because you can have a group of 2 to 7 characters running a ship like this, exploring the galaxy, and getting into all kinds of trouble. So as a plot device, as a home for your space adventurers, this kind of ship is king. A real-life comparison would be like a small yacht or workboat, but on the combat side of things, maybe a bit on the larger end, would be something like the Rosinante from The Expanse. A real-life direct comparison would be something like a PT boat from World War II. The advantage of such ships over larger ones is that they are fast, they strike hard, and they get out. I honestly love the size class of these ships. They are like homes for your characters. And for a real space vessel of this type, we currently already have had one, and that would be the Space Shuttle, which is more of a transport, of course. So let's move on to B, the Corvette, frigate, and destroyer-sized ships. So now we're looking at something between 100 to 200 meters. We'll tackle the combat side of this first. A ship of this size, in both Star Wars and Star Trek universe, would be considered a kind of escort ship, destroyer, or deep space scout. Other ships of comparable size would be the Corellian gunship from Star Wars, the Klingon bird of prey, and the Deadly Defiant from Star Trek. On the sea, this would fall into the category of most naval destroyers and frigates. In real-life space, we do not yet have an equivalent, but I suspect when we finally send manned interplanetary spacecraft to places like Mars, they will be about this size class or larger. The advantage of ships like these is that they can protect larger ships from the aforementioned gunboats or torpedo boats, and they have a bit more utility, with sometimes hangar bays, more living space and storage space, a bit larger weapons, and they're nimble enough to get out of danger or rapidly respond to threats. The resources or expense to build such ships has to be taken into account. Each individual ship is not that expensive, but large fleets of such ships can be pretty expensive, perhaps even more expensive than building much larger ships with superiority built in. In fact, the Japanese took this route in World War II, knowing that they were limited in resources and unable to outproduce their rivals. They would instead focus on larger ships of higher quality, which led to a doctrine of bigger is better, at least in their minds. We'll get to more of that later. C. Cruiser category. Now let's move on to the third category, a good old cruiser-sized ship, like the Constitution-class Enterprise from Star Trek. Ships of this size have several advantages. Now you finally have a large enough ship that can probably go much further for long periods of time. A cruiser almost always has some kind of hangar bay, passable living space, and amenities for the crew, fairly destructive weapons, and some cargo capacity. Equivalents to this would also be the Nebulon B frigate from Star Wars, and the Vexor class cruiser from EVE Online. And please, if you have some other favorite cruisers, don't forget to say so in the comments. But we're looking at ships that are between 200 to 350 meters long. To me, this size class is just about right and feels at home to me. I would prefer to be the captain of a cruiser as opposed to any other kind of ship. A cruiser can still be fast and maneuverable. It can fit heavy weapons. It can be something of a light carrier. It can go long distances without consequence. The idea of a ship of this size, I feel at home with, and in my opinion, when we get ships much larger than this, we start to have major drawbacks, and I'll explain that. Real-life naval equivalents would be the U.S. Navy's Ticonderoga-class missile cruisers. With its advanced Aegis missile defense system, it's designed to help defend something like a carrier task force. And in World War II, you have ships like the USS Indianapolis, delivering components of the atomic bomb, a perfect mission for a ship of this size. I can envision a real-life spaceship in this category, again perhaps being one of our first manned missions to Mars or even beyond. Perhaps at a certain point when we get efficient nuclear fusion propulsion, something along the lines of what we see in The Expanse. Such ships will have a multi-role mission of interplanetary exploration and colony support. Alright, D. Battleship or carrier-sized vessels. Now I've jumped up significantly in size. I've kind of skipped battlecruisers. But let's get to something like an Imperial Star Destroyer at 1,600 meters long. So now we're talking about ships that are somewhere between just under 700 meters long up to about 2 kilometers long. This is definitely getting into the range of a city in space, where tens of thousands of crew or passengers could be on such a ship. But to justify a ship of this size, you need a damn good practical reason. First, the military application of superships like this, and then the civilian application, as there are arguably even more civilian applications for ships of this size than combat. In the Star Trek universe, there are not really any Starfleet ships that match this. Perhaps the D'Deridex Warbird comes close, and some Dominion battleships. In a military application, there are only two reasons to have such a large vessel. One is to mount very large, purpose-built weapons, and two, to carry something. In the case of weapons, as we're now talking about battleships. In the case of carrying something, we're talking about assault ships or, more likely, carriers. The Imperial Star Destroyer is kind of both. The hardest target to break in the Star Wars universe are either massive space stations or planetary shield generators, and occasionally other capital ships. The only way to do this is to mount some really massive guns, in this case, heavy turbolasers. We kind of see something like this in Star Trek during the major fleet assaults on Deep Space Nine, where ships like the Negvar and the Jem'Hadar battleships were required to really break through the space station's defenses. This is what we call a siege weapon, something you need to break through a fortification, which is what an Imperial Star Destroyer is for. Now, a Star Destroyer, by itself, has some problems defending itself from fighter bombers or smaller destroyers or torpedo boats, and that is why it carries 72 TIE fighters of various types. But optimally, you typically would want to treat your Star Destroyer like a carrier in a task force, and have smaller cruisers defending it. Obviously, the biggest disadvantage of such large ships is its maneuvering. The second disadvantage is that it's large, it's a primary target, and once it's gone, the loss is devastating. A dedicated carrier, on the other hand, can sacrifice some protection and armament for speed. Apparently, the Venator-class Star Destroyer, a precursor to the more heavily armed Imperial Star Destroyer, is more of a carrier than a battleship. It has the option of only risking fighters while trying to stay out of the fray, but also, it's not as severe a loss as something like a battleship of similar size. In real-life history, this was the case Admiral Yamamoto always made regarding the Japanese Navy. In spite of this, the Japanese still built the very expensive and massive Yamato, the largest battleship ever built in history. And the Yamato rarely got a chance to engage any other surface warships with her enormous guns, and never participated in bombardment, but she was sunk easily by over 300 US planes. Now, the civilian application of such ships are far more practical than you might think, and that would simply be a freighter or tanker, like this Providence from EVE Online. You can carry almost anything in a large enough freighter. Perhaps in real life someday, we will have giant interplanetary freighters to transport resources or even passengers, and perhaps for interstellar travel, without warp drive, you would almost need a huge ship for giant fusion or antimatter engines. Okay, our E category. Let's get into super ships. Now, these would be ships like the Executor class Star Dreadnought, the Eclipse class Star Dreadnought, or perhaps even a Borg Cube from Star Trek. I like to use the Eclipse class because the purpose of it is clear, and that is to mount the super weapon, which is similar to a Death Star laser. This super weapon can crack the crust of a planet, which means in most cases the planet becomes a molten hellscape. This certainly gets past most planetary defenses or battle stations without a problem. Unfortunately, Darth Vader's Executor, I'm kind of the opinion that it's less practical because it doesn't have an obvious super weapon. If it does, we've never seen it. I'm not entirely sure what purpose such a ship would serve, that several other Star Destroyers couldn't do on their own, except perhaps as a mobile dry dock and shipyard. But to me, this would imply that the ship is meant to go into deep space without support. Oh well, the Executor did eventually meet its end at the hands of the rebels at Endor. And for our final category, we have megaships, or what some would call a world ship, which would include ships that are tens of thousands of kilometers in size. One of my favorite examples of such ships would be the Hordaz class world ships from EVE Online at about 50 kilometers in width. It actually carries a little Stargate with it that smaller ships can go through. Or Snoke's Mega Star Destroyer, the Supremacy, at 60 kilometers in width, from the non-canon Star Wars sequel trilogy. And well, I guess if you could call it a ship, we could include the Death Star from Star Wars. Also, the Vorlon Planet Killers from Babylon 5 at about 50 kilometers in length. And also V'ger's vessel in Star Trek the Motion Picture at about 30 kilometers in length. Now you'll notice that all the ships I just mentioned are pretty much built to destroy planets. So this is their purpose. The other function of such ships is to be more of a mobile habitat, a kind of moving colony for thousands or millions of beings. This is certainly the case for Arthur C. Clarke's Rama, which was a giant cylinder about 30 kilometers long, designed as a kind of habitat for 3 sentient species at a time. In the last example, in the case of Rama, this seems to be kind of a more realistic hardcore sci-fi scenario, because you have pretty much what is a rotating O'Neill cylinder that generates its own gravity through rotation. It travels at speeds below the speed of light, but fast enough to get to relativistic speeds. Rama acts in many ways like the mysterious Oumuamua that came in from interstellar space as a mysterious object, and it still baffles and intrigues scientists to this day. But the Rama books were excellent books, by the way. In the end, I would say, while yes, very large ships can strike on us, as it does indicate an impressive level of engineering, I think a lot of times us guys especially often get a little bit too obsessed with the bigger is better mentality. A giant ship, unless it's a carrier, freighter, or has a super weapon, honestly does not have much of a combat purpose, and once it's destroyed, it's lost and gone forever. In one of the games I play called Empyreon, we can build or spawn custom ships. Many people spawn really giant ships that require giant thrusters, power plants, and CPU cores to run, but they often don't have the power or the CPU capacity to run any more weapons or shields, so it becomes kind of a prestige piece. Alright space friends, update on the channel. I had to deal with some stuff over the last 2 months, the details of which I'll be happy to share at patreon.com/resurrected, but I'm back on track making videos. I've been working on a new Star Trek TNG and EVE Online crossover scenario video. This will be kind of in the format of an informal Star Trek episode like the last one I did, so subscribe to receive updates and works in progress on that, or head on over to patreon.com/resurrected. I've also begun to sell my 3D models on Patreon without the need for you to become a member. Of course, higher tier members automatically get access to those models, such as my Galaxy class, Constitution class, Daenerys, or others, but I understand that for many a longer term commitment is not of interest. However, I've also made custom starship renders or even animations for some higher tier Patreon members. So have a look at patreon.com/resurrected and please comment on what you think the functions of various ship sizes are. Until next time, space friends.